Good afternoon on today's Angry Bulletin. In this, our third installment about the many problems that Artemis faces as we try to return to the moon over a half-century absence, we examine the latest report from the NASA Office of Inspector General. And to be quite frank, the news isn't terribly good about lunar Starship, at least if you wanted to land on the moon in 2025 or even in 2026. And the situation with the spacesuits might even be worse. All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to the Angry Astronaut back here in the UK, which is going to be a big benefit for my supporters on Discord because now I have a 7-hour advantage from the time that I used to operate with in my dad's basement in Colorado, so early releases should become a regular thing from here on out. I hope you guys enjoy it, and if you'd like to take advantage of all that, well, all the details are in the description if you'd like to become part of that growing Discord community. Okay, enough of that. Let's go ahead and talk about Starship. So yeah, a lot of my videos lately have been about this topic, unsurprisingly, given the spectacular launch that took place not that long ago now. And of course, we are eagerly looking forward to OFT3. But all that having been said, how close is Starship really from making a lunar mission possible? Now, for years during Starship's development, it wasn't about the moon at all. It was all about Mars and what was going to be necessary in order to make all of that happen. However, when SpaceX, for better or worse, won the HLS contract, the most immediate concern, the most pressing deadline that NASA and SpaceX had to face was trying to get lunar Starship ready for a 2025 lunar mission. And for most of you probably know that I've been saying that all of that is impossible, and now NASA's Office of Inspector General has finally admitted that that's true. The earliest date that we're looking at this point is probably 2027. It may even be a little later than that. Now, for those of you who are huge SpaceX fans, feel that they can do no wrong, if you're easily triggered, probably want to just go ahead and stop watching at this point because the Office of Inspector General is not terribly forgiving. They look at all the details, they examine the facts through a very harsh lens, and they give their assessment. And although their assessment is a lot more favorable than the grades that they've been giving SLS as of late, well, there's a whole lot of things about Starship that are going to make a near-term mission to the moon pretty impractical. And it may be some time before we're actually going to see Americans or Western Europeans, Canadians, whoever is included on these missions actually set foot on the moon. And this, frankly, puts the entire project at risk. Now, two quick remarks. First of all, I would like to thank Nick Henning and the incredible animations that he put together for Lunar Starship, even though it doesn't include the water deluge system, because way back when he made this, we really didn't know anything about that. Still, this is an amazing depiction of what Lunar Starship and its operations will probably look like. And also, I would like to mention that the NASA Office of Inspector General does not talk about Starship as if it's a bad idea or just a lousy concept. It has no comments to make as far as that's concerned. Rather, this is all about whether or not Lunar Starship is going to be realistically ready to land human beings on the moon anytime soon. And it is somewhat problematic because, once again, this is not only the biggest rocket in human history, it's also one of the most complicated because of its full reusability. And unless we take advantage of that reusability, this rocket is not going to be cost effective for getting people to the moon. Let me try to explain why. Here, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the process, is how NASA intends to put astronauts on the moon. First of all, Starship needs to get to orbit. Now, that's something that hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen soon, hopefully. But also, we're going to need to have full reusability accomplished with Starship before we can realistically get to the moon, because Starship needs to be refueled a whole bunch of times before it can actually make a journey to the moon, because it's so heavy and it requires a lot of propellant to get to lunar orbit, rendezvous with the astronauts there, and set down on the moon. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Step 1, SpaceX launches a propellant depot into orbit. Probably one of these starships that we've seen that has no flaps or fins on it. That may be a prototype for the depot. In any event, that is launched into orbit first, possibly with a couple hundred tons of fuel on board with it. After that, a series of tanker starships needs to be launched into orbit as well, and transfer fuel and oxidizer into the propellant depot. Once the depot is completely full, then and only then does Lunar Starship launch into orbit, transfer all of the propellant and oxidizer into Lunar Starship from the depot, and make its way to the moon, to a rectilinear halo orbit where Lunar Gateway is going to be, or in the case of Artemis 3, just the Orion spacecraft is ultimately going to rendezvous with it. However, that won't happen until NASA is confident that Starship is operating properly and that the propellant isn't boiling away into space. After that, SLS launches, heads to lunar orbit as well, or more specifically, it launches Orion to cislunar space to that same rectilinear halo orbit. Orion will then either dock with Starship or dock with the Lunar Gateway, depending on the mission. Then astronauts will be transferred into Lunar Starship to be set down on the moon. In the case of Artemis 3, it will only be 2 astronauts transferring directly from Orion into Lunar Starship. After that, Lunar Starship descends down to the lunar surface, spends a week or so there in the case of Artemis 3, or maybe a little bit longer with subsequent missions up to a month or perhaps even 60 days, and then Lunar Starship takes the astronauts back up to the Lunar Gateway or back to Orion, and then Orion takes the astronauts safely back home. Lunar Starship is either discarded at that point or used as a future lunar base on the surface, or returned to low Earth orbit where it can be refueled and used again. That's the ideal scenario, but one that isn't necessarily called for in the current missions. Does that sound complicated enough for you? It's way more complicated than Apollo was, but perhaps that's necessary if you want to go to the moon to stay. Now, from here on out, I'm going to be quoting extensively from the NASA OIG report. First, we need to give you an idea of how NASA completes projects. There's quite a few steps involved, and Starship, frankly, is not terribly far along in the process. First of all, you have pre-phase A. Now, fortunately, Starship has gotten past that, developing the range of cost and schedule estimates for uses such as budget planning, and then during phase B, the project team develops programmatic measures and technical leading indicators that track various project metrics such as requirement changes, staffing demands, and mass and power utilization. Near the end of the formulation, leading up to the preliminary design review, or PDR, the project team completes technology development and its preliminary design. Fortunately, Starship has reached that PDR point. However, formulation culminates in a review at what's called KDP-C, or Key Decision Point C, where senior leaders approve the cost and schedule agency baseline commitments. After a project holds KDP-C, it begins implementation, consisting of Phase C, where the project team holds a critical design review to determine whether the design performs as expected and is stable enough to support proceeding with final design and fabrication. mission. As of right now, the program is approaching KDPC, but is not quite done. Now, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but by way of comparison, the Dynetics Alpaca reached its preliminary design review 3 years ago, to give you an idea of just how far behind Lunar Starship is from other proposals, at least the proposal that I always thought could get us to the moon a lot more expeditiously. But let's go on, because that's not what this video is about. It's about Lunar Starship, damn it. Here's why the Office of Inspector General feels that Starship will not be ready at least until 2027. Quote, "The contractor is facing multiple issues that limit this progress and jeopardize its ability to support an Artemis 3 mission in 2025. These issues include an ambitious schedule, delays to key events, an incomplete orbital flight test, and a large volume of remaining technical work." Let's start with the ambitious schedule. We found that if the HLS development takes as many months as NASA major projects do on average, the Artemis 3 mission would likely occur in early 2027. Our analysis of past NASA projects that have launched since 2010 found that the average development time from project start to launch was 92 months. NASA has already delayed the Artemis 3 mission to December of 2025, extending the HLS development time to 79 months. However, this is still 13 months faster than the average development time for NASA major projects. Okay, well, that's no big deal. We all know that SpaceX goes way faster than your average NASA project, right? No problem then. Well, from everything we've seen thus far, that's actually not the case. Quote, "While SpaceX and NASA are aiming to complete development more than a year faster than the average for NASA major projects, they are achieving key events at a slower pace. For example, we found that SpaceX used more than 50% of its total schedule to reach preliminary design review in November of 2022. On average, NASA project used about 35% of the total schedule to reach this milestone. Furthermore, the HLS program is taking longer to reach KDPC, the next key review after the preliminary design review, than average for the NASA major projects we assessed. As a result, the HLS program is proceeding with development without formal approval of a cost and schedule baseline. Specifically, the HLS program plans to use nearly 14% of its total schedule to proceed from PDR to KDPC, while on average, NASA major project used just 4.2% more of their schedule to achieve KDPC. So, SpaceX, in spite of all of its extremely fast progress in the past, is not proceeding at the same kind of speed that other NASA projects make. Now, this should surprise nobody. This is the biggest, the most ambitious rocket in human history. It shouldn't proceed at the same pace as an average NASA project. So if this is indeed the case, and Starship proceeds actually slower than your average NASA project, we could be looking at a launch in 2028, or perhaps even later. But there's a lot more bad news than that. The second category is delays to key events. And although SpaceX and NASA continue to make progress on the human landing system, including completing some work early, overall, the HLS program and SpaceX, according to the NASA OIG report, delayed 8 out of 13 key events by between 6 and 13 months. Of those delayed events, at least 2 will occur in 2025, the year that the Artemis 3 mission is scheduled to take place. Partially as a result of those delays, SpaceX plans to complete 8 key events between November of 2023 and the planned date of the Artemis 3 mission, which, in my opinion, is impossible. The NASA OIG report goes on to say, quote, due to delays to several key events, NASA will have a relatively short amount of time to ensure that the HLS complies with human spaceflight safety requirements before missions start. For example, NASA delayed the HLS design certification review, which is now closer to the Artemis 3 mission than originally planned. At this review, NASA will ensure that the design complies with requirements in human spaceflight certification. According to NASA documentation, this milestone needs to be completed 9 months prior to launch. As of September 2023, NASA and SpaceX also plan to complete flight readiness reviews for the depot, tanker, and lander versions of Starship within the same 9-month period before Artemis 3. NASA and SpaceX will have less time to address any issues identified during these reviews before the mission. SpaceX representatives told us that the 3 flight readiness reviews will always occur within the same length of time to support the Artemis 3 mission due to the nature and cadence of reviews. Any additional delays to these key events will compound the schedule pressure on NASA and SpaceX. And then there's the matter of the incomplete orbital flight test, which we really shouldn't be surprised that it's not done yet. And the last launch was very successful in many important respects, but NASA needs a complete orbital flight test. Now, by the way, the OIG report does not include the latest orbital flight test, but rather the one that took place on 4/20. And the fact that Starship did not achieve orbit during this last test is just going to compound the problems that are already being pointed out in this report. Once again, I am not disappointed or shocked that SpaceX has failed to reach orbit with Starship. It would be a miracle for that to happen on the second test flight, but facts are facts. Quote, the incomplete orbital flight test led NASA to delay many key test events that are dependent on completion of that test. For example, NASA officials said that the in-space propellant transfer test will be delayed because it requires SpaceX to demonstrate that the Starship vehicle can reach orbit. Likewise, HLS officials told us that Starship tests are sequentially linked, so future test flights, including the uncrewed flight test, depend on SpaceX successfully completing both the orbital flight and in-space propellant transfer tests. A successful orbital flight test is also needed to execute the technology maturation plan for the human landing system. For example, according to SpaceX representatives, the April 2023 orbital flight test was key to demonstrating and understanding many aspects of the launch operations and ascent performance. SpaceX representatives said that they collected early in-flight data on the Raptor engines, vehicle tanks, and primary structures and pad and ground systems for the orbital flight test. And I'm sure this second flight test gave SpaceX even more information. However, HLS officials stated that SpaceX is still required to perform a successful booster separation, ignite the Starship's engines, and achieve a suborbital altitude. HLS officials said that reaching orbit is essential for Starship development, and they expect that SpaceX's pace of design changes is likely to increase after a successful test flight, allowing them to make progress on finalizing the design and building hardware. And I'm not through yet. Also, there's a substantial amount of technical work that remains. It includes Raptor engine development. Now, this, in my opinion, has taken a massive step forward. This recent test flight that SpaceX carried out demonstrates that the Raptor 2, at least, appears to be a very solid and reliable engine now. Super impressive. However, if SpaceX needs to develop a Raptor 3 before this HLS program can continue, well, that could extend the entire project. However, the most important factor is the on-orbit propellant transfer technology. Quote, SpaceX has remaining technical work to develop its on-orbit propellant storage and transfer technology. HLS program documentation states that propellant storage and transfer technologies have not not previously flown on an integrated propulsion-like system. The documentation noted that to date, SpaceX has made limited progress in maturing those technologies. Those technologies include docking sensors and mechanisms to identify, locate, and then physically align the HLS Starship and the tanker Starship for fluid transfer, propellant measurement to gauge the amount of propellant in the tanks and how much was transferred, and storage capability to mitigate fuel loss in space. SpaceX plans to conduct the in-space propellant storage and transfer test to further mature the technology, but the timing of this test is dependent on successful completion of preceding flights. SpaceX representatives said that the fundamental propellant transfer technology is not unique, but requires engineering time and development effort to fully design and test for eventual use in the Artemis 3 mission. If the docking hardware does not perform as expected during spaceflight testing, significant vehicle modifications may be required, which could delay the mission. HLS officials said that SpaceX must demonstrate these technologies prior to completing the critical design review to promote confidence in the mission concept of operations. Man, that is a tall order, and I'm still not done. There's also the issue of lander software and hardware integration. Quote, the HLS program is addressing a cross-program risk relating to integrating the system's software and hardware with the Orion program. Integration of software developed for dissimilar hardware platforms using different operating systems, as well as the use and integration of heritage software, can be challenging and prone to introducing defects. HLS risk documentation states that adequate test facilities and test campaigns are required to avoid late discovery of critical software defects because critical issues are often uncovered when the software is integrated and tested with flight hardware. Therefore, without adequate testing, it is possible that critical software defects could be missed. This situation could result in cost and schedule effects, or worse, potential loss of mission and crew. But hey, we all know that Boeing software is fantastic, right? Surely it will be perfectly compatible with SpaceX software. So, a very, very lengthy list of challenges. Now, to be clear, I am 100% confident that SpaceX is going to be able to accomplish all of these things. But here's the problem. The longer it takes and the more deadlines that get missed, the more additional tests that need to be performed, more orbital flight tests, etc. First of all, it becomes very expensive for SpaceX. I would think they probably already burned up all the money that NASA has given to them up to this point, which means this money is coming out of SpaceX's coffers, or more specifically, Elon's coffers. On top of that, the longer this process takes, the better the chance is that the government is just going to shut it down if it's not providing tangible results. Keep in mind, 2027 will mark the beginning of a new administration. That's assuming that Biden gets reelected, or even if Trump gets elected and he also supports the Artemis program, well, he can't serve any more than 2 terms either, so we're going to have somebody brand new at the beginning of 2027, and if we still don't have a solid projected landing date for Artemis 3, it's very possible that Congress or the president could lose hope in the whole thing and decide to shut the whole thing down. It's one of many factors that need to be considered. In addition, we also need to keep our eyes on the Chinese. The longer this takes, the less of a lead NASA and the United States has over China, and if China manages to make it to the moon first, they're going to start staking claims, and they're not going to give a damn who made it to the moon first 50 years ago. And we still need to talk about the spacesuit issue, because that is just as problematic, but we have run out of time. So in my next episode on this topic, we will wrap up the subject of Artemis challenges. Are the spacesuits looking any better than the other aspects of this program? Well, I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler. No, I'm afraid they're not. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and please subscribe. It's so important to the future of my channel. Also, please consider checking the description for various ways to keep this content coming. And as always, stay angry about space.